For my entire childhood, my family treated me like a failed experiment. My sister was the beautiful, glamorous one. My brother was the brilliant heir, and I was just a stain on the background. At our grand family gathering, my aunt walked right up to me with a stranger, pointing directly at my face as if I were a speck of dirt on a flawless Persian rug. "This is the one we never talk about," she laughed without a care in the world. I looked at my aunt, then calmly turned my gaze to the stranger. The stranger reached into her perfectly tailored suit jacket, pulled out a gold-embossed business card, and stared dead into my aunt's eyes. "Actually," she said coldly, "she is the exact reason I am here today."
You see, I was hiding a massive secret. Before I tell you how a single piece of paper completely shattered my family's illusion of perfection, please let me know in the comments where you're watching this story from right now, and if you have ever had to stand up to family members who completely underestimated your worth. Please hit like and subscribe.
My name is Clara, and I am 35 years old. Growing up in the wealthy enclave of Greenwich, Connecticut, meant that everything revolved around status and outward appearances. My parents, Arthur and Eleanor, poured all their energy into presenting a flawless life to their old money friends at the country club and our massive extended family. To outsiders, we were the definition of the American elite. But inside the high walls of that mansion, I was practically invisible. My parents assigned rigid roles to each of their children, and if you didn't fit the mold, you were discarded. I was the one who never fit in. The annual family reunion was always my parents' ultimate stage, to showcase their proudest achievements, namely, my brother and sister. This year's gathering was a vow renewal ceremony to celebrate my parents' 40th anniversary, held at an ultra-luxury mountain estate in Aspen, Colorado. The property was massive, boasting breathtaking views of the Rocky Mountains, meticulously manicured evergreen gardens, and a giant heated stone patio where dozens of relatives were currently mingling with drinks in hand. Holding a glass of sparkling water, I stood near a massive cedar pillar at the edge of the patio, watching the circus from a distance. The crisp mountain air swept across the terrace, mixing with the scent of expensive cigars and custom perfumes. I was wearing an incredibly understated, quiet, luxury cashmere set. The deep midnight blue fit my frame perfectly, and it cost more than most people's down payment on a house. Yet, my family completely ignored it, assuming it was just some cheap, off-the-rack outfit from a discount department store. They always assumed the worst of me, and my clothing was no exception. I watched my parents bask in flattery at the center of the patio. My father, Arthur, spoke with a booming voice that easily carried over the soft jazz playing from the hidden outdoor speakers. Holding a glass of aged single malt whiskey, he gestured wildly while bragging to my uncles. My brother Julian stood right beside him, soaking in the praise as if it were his birthright. Julian is 38 and holds the official title of business genius in our family. My parents were loudly broadcasting to everyone that Julian's commercial real estate syndicate had just secured another landmark building in Manhattan. Julian puffed out his chest, wearing a very flashy, custom Tom Ford suit, an arrogant smirk fixed on his face. He was talking down to our younger cousins about inflation hedges and mezzanine financing, acting as though he were the ultimate authority on the global economy.
I took a slow sip of my water. I knew the actual balance sheet of his crumbling real estate firm all too well, but I chose to keep quiet.
On the other side of the courtyard was my sister Chloe. Chloe is 28 and has always been the face of the family. Surrounded by a crowd of aunts and cousins, she was flaunting her wrist. She recently married a Silicon Valley tech entrepreneur, and right now she was making sure the winter sun caught every possible angle of her diamond-encrusted, limited edition Patek Philippe watch. Her sharp, artificial laughter echoed across the stone patio every few seconds. My mother Eleanor hovered right behind Chloe, constantly smoothing her hair and boasting to anyone who would listen about the incredibly lavish charity gala Chloe was hosting in the Hamptons. Leaning against the cold cedar pillar, I let out a faint sigh. I had flown 4 hours to get here, knowing exactly how today would play out. For 35 years, I had endured this exact dynamic. I was the failed experiment, the stepping stone they pushed into the shadows to make their golden children shine brighter. I wasn't pretty enough to be a trophy wife like Chloe, and I didn't have the ruthless Wall Street swagger they wanted Julian to have. I was quiet, logical, and highly observant. Years ago, when I told them I was interested in supply chain logistics and biopharmaceutical distribution networks, my father literally laughed in my face, warning me not to embarrass him by becoming a grease-stained truck dispatcher. Suddenly, a movement caught my eye. My Aunt Margaret was walking across the patio, heading straight for me. Margaret is my mother's older sister, and she possesses the exact same toxic traits. She thrives on making herself feel superior by putting others down. Today, she wasn't alone. Walking beside her was a sharp professional woman holding a high-end leather briefcase. This woman radiated absolute authority, and her sharp charcoal business suit demanded immediate respect. I recognized her instantly, but I didn't let it show on my face. Her name was Marcus. As Margaret approached, an exaggerated fake smile spread across her face. She was clearly looking to put on a show in front of this stranger. Given Marcus's professional attire, Margaret likely assumed she was a wealthy guest or a senior representative of the estate's management. Margaret loved playing the elegant matriarch, boasting about her successful family to anyone who would listen. But whenever she needed a negative example to contrast against Julian and Chloe's brilliance, she always dragged me out to be criticized. "Well, look who decided to crawl out of the shadows," Margaret announced loudly, ensuring several nearby cousins turned to watch the interaction. She waved a hand adorned with a heavy diamond bracelet casually in my direction. "Marcus, I was just telling you about my niece Chloe, who lives an incredible high society life, and my nephew Julian, who is practically a golden boy on Wall Street." Margaret let out a dramatic, exaggerated sigh, then pointed directly at me. "And this is Clara, the ugly duckling of our group." I didn't even blink. I just stood there, quietly watching Margaret, whose cheeks were flushed with excitement from belittling me. "We don't usually mention her," Margaret continued, her voice dripping with condescending pity. "She does something with trucks and logistics in some rundown warehouse, I think. She's essentially our family charity case." Margaret turned to Marcus, expecting the stranger to laugh along or offer a sympathetic nod. "Just ignore her," Margaret added with a cruel smirk. "She will probably never get married. She simply lacks the charm and the looks. She has been such a disappointment to my sister. But then again, every family has one setback, right?" A few nearby cousins covered their mouths, letting out sharp, piercing giggles. I could see my mother, Eleanor, glancing over from across the patio with a look of mild annoyance, as if my mere presence was ruining the aesthetic of her perfect family gathering. They all expected me to look down at my shoes. They expected me to shrink in shame, turn red with embarrassment, and quietly excuse myself to go cry in the restroom. That was the script they had written for me. The ugly duckling who knew her place at the bottom of the family food chain. But I was no longer the scared, lonely girl they had bullied for over 3 decades. I stood tall, maintaining unfaltering eye contact with my aunt. The silence between us grew heavy and thick. Marcus, the sharp stranger, did not laugh. She didn't offer a single sympathetic nod to my aunt either. Instead, a look of deep disgust crossed her face as she stared coldly at Margaret. The jazz music from the outdoor speakers suddenly felt incredibly distant. The clinking of crystal glasses around us seemed to stop entirely. Marcus reached into the inside pocket of her tailored charcoal suit jacket and pulled out a thick high-end business card with raised lettering in gold embossing. She extended it, but not to me. She handed it directly to Margaret.
Actually, she's the exact reason I am here today, Marcus said, her voice crisp and authoritative, cutting through the party noise like a knife.
Margaret froze, her fake smile locking onto her face as she stared blankly at the card. "What do you mean?" Margaret stammered. "Are you her manager from that logistics warehouse?" Marcus took a step forward, closing the distance between them. "I am the chief legal officer for the largest private biologistics and supply chain holding group in the country," Marcus declared firmly. "And she is my boss." The colour instantly drained from my aunt's face. Over by the long buffet tables, my brother Julian choked on his words mid-sentence. My mother, Eleanor, turned around completely, her eyes locked onto us. Marcus did not lower her voice. In fact, she intentionally let her words carry across the entire patio. "Clara is the founder and CEO of the top medical supply chain and logistics defense network in North America," Marcus announced to the stunned crowd. "And exactly 1 hour ago, she became the majority shareholder of the investment group that just purchased this entire Aspen Mountain estate in full." My aunt's jaw practically dropped to the floor. She looked at me, then at Marcus, then back at me, as if her brain couldn't process the information. My sister Chloe lowered her wrist, her limited edition watch completely forgotten by everyone around her. My father, Arthur, nearly dropped his expensive glass of whiskey. I remained absolutely calm. Reaching out, I took the heavy manila folder from Marcus. Inside were the final transfer deeds for the very land my family was currently standing on. I let a slow, deliberate smile spread across my face as I looked at the people who had spent my entire life calling me a failure, watching their expressions freeze in total shock. The rules of the game had completely changed, and they had absolutely no idea what was coming next. The silence that fell over the patio was absolute. It was a heavy, suffocating quiet that weighed on everyone's chest. For 35 years, I had been the family ghost, the punchline to their cruel jokes. Now, that ghost had just handed them an eviction notice disguised as a property deed. Margaret was the first to break the dead silence. Her face twitched, and her heavy makeup suddenly looked like a fragile mask. "This is some kind of sick joke," she stammered, her voice turning sharp with rising panic. She looked over her shoulder at my mother, desperately seeking permission to laugh it all off. "You hired an actor, Clara, just to come here and ruin your parents' 40th anniversary. This is pathetic, truly pathetic." Marcus didn't even blink. She took a step forward, her presence completely commanding the space. She didn't raise her voice, but her tone was sharp enough to cut through glass. "Miss Margaret, there is no prank here. If you look closely at the documents in my client's hands, you will see the official seal of the state of Colorado and the county clerk's certification. Apex Biologistics, a company founded from scratch by Clara, completed the acquisition of the Aspen Mountain Resort Holding Group 48 hours ago. The ink is dry and the wire transfer has cleared." My father, Arthur, roughly pushed his way through the stunned crowd of cousins, his face turning a deep crimson. Without even asking, he snatched the manila folder straight out of my hands. He had always believed he had an inherent right to control everything I owned. I let him take it. I wanted him to read it. I wanted him to see the numbers in black and white with his own eyes. He stared down at the documents, his eyes darting across the complex legal terms. This was a man who prided himself on absolute control, and I could see the exact moment he realized that control had slipped entirely through his fingers. His hands began to tremble slightly, causing the heavy parchment to shake. "This can't be right," Arthur muttered, his voice losing its usual booming authority. "This holding group wasn't even listed on the public market. We've been trying to negotiate a stake in this property for months. How did you even get in touch with the sellers?" I remained completely relaxed, my hands resting comfortably at my sides. I didn't need to be aggressive. Real power doesn't need to shout. When you control the core supply chain network and medical data infrastructure of the private equity firm that owns this holding company, I explained calmly, they tend to look very favourably on your acquisition offers. They wanted a fast, quiet cash transaction. And I happened to offer exactly what they wanted. Julian finally strode over, abandoning his audience of younger cousins. He aggressively snatched the documents from our father's hands, quickly scanning the pages. Julian had always built his identity on being the smartest guy in the room. He was the financial prodigy, the son destined to carry the family legacy into the next generation. The realization that I had not only outsmarted him, but completely outmaneuvered him in a major real estate acquisition was causing his brain to short-circuit. "This is heavily leveraged," Julian announced loudly, pointing a finger at me. He tried to sound confident, but I could hear the desperate edge in his voice. "You must have taken out a massive loan against your overvalued logistics startup. You're probably buried in debt just to show off at a family reunion. This is a house of cards. You don't have the actual capital to back this up." Marcus looked at my brother with a mix of pity and professional disdain. "Mr. Anderson, my client never relies on leverage for personal acquisitions. The purchase of this $35 million mountain estate was executed entirely in cash. Apex Logistics carries zero corporate debt, and Clara retains 85% equity in the company. Your sister isn't playing with a house of cards. She is the bank." The words $35 million in cash echoed across the stone patio. I heard my Aunt Susan drop her champagne glass. It shattered against the stone, but nobody moved to clean it up. The catering staff stood completely frozen, holding trays of appetizers, watching the drama unfold like a movie. My sister, Chloe, pushed her way to the front. Her perfect hair flew in the cold wind, her face twisted into a mixture of confusion and sheer panic. She looked at the documents, then at Julian, and finally at me. "What does that even mean?" she demanded. "What is she talking about, Julian?" "It means I own the entire mountain you plan to ski on this winter, Chloe," I said. "I own the private ski lift you were just bragging about to your friends. I own every single square inch of this estate." Chloe gasped, instinctively clutching the Patek Philippe on her wrist as if I were about to reach out and take that too. She turned to our mother for support. Eleanor was still standing near the catering tent, all the colour drained from her face. For my entire life, my mother had controlled the narrative. She decided who was successful, who was beautiful, and who was worthy of love. She had spent decades telling the world I was a hopeless failure. Seeing me standing here, holding the deed to a massive estate she could only dream of owning, completely shattered her reality. "You lied to us," Eleanor finally spoke, her voice trembling with intense indignation. She walked slowly toward me, her eyes wide with a mixture of anger and shock. "You let us believe you were working some entry-level dispatch job in a rundown warehouse. You let us worry about your pathetic future." "I never lied to you, Mother," I replied, keeping my tone perfectly even. "I just stopped correcting your arrogant assumptions. When I was a teenager, you unilaterally decided I was a failure because I didn't fit your exact mold of what a daughter should be. Every time I tried to talk to you about my business model, you forcefully shifted the conversation to Chloe's wealthy boyfriend or Julian's Wall Street promotions. You never once asked what my company actually did. You never asked if I was happy. You just assumed I was miserable because it fit the family script you wanted to tell." Margaret tried to regain her footing, crossing her arms and tilting her chin up. "Well, if you're so rich now, why are you dressed so poorly? You could have at least dressed up a little for a family gathering instead of showing up in this boring, plain suit." Marcus actually let out a sharp, dry laugh. "That boring, plain suit, Miss Margaret, is a one-of-a-kind piece, custom-tailored for Clara by Loro Piana in Milan. It costs more than all the jewelry you are wearing today combined. Just because she doesn't feel the need to plaster herself and tacky logos to prove her worth doesn't mean she lacks taste. It simply means she has nothing to prove to people who only look at the surface. Margaret's mouth shut instantly. She looked down at the heavy diamond bracelet on her wrist, suddenly looking incredibly small. The power dynamic on the patio had completely reversed. The same family members who had ignored me or whispered cruel jokes behind my back for the past hour were now staring at me with a mix of fear and absolute awe. The cousins who had giggled at Margaret's ugly duckling comment were now staring at their shoes, completely terrified of making eye contact with me. My father tried to salvage whatever dignity he had left. He squared his shoulders and adjusted his expensive tie. "Well," he said, forcing a booming laugh that sounded completely hollow, "it seems we have a lot to celebrate today. Not only do we have Julian's another successful acquisition and Chloe's wonderful marriage, but our little Clara clearly kept a massive surprise from us. We should open a bottle of the finest champagne. The Anderson family has truly conquered the world." He stepped forward, opening his arms as if to embrace me. He wanted to claim my victory as his own. He wanted to fold my business empire into the Anderson family legacy. He wanted everyone watching to believe my success was the direct result of his superior parenting. I deliberately took a step back, avoiding his embrace. My father's arms fell awkwardly to his sides, the forced smile on his face cracking. "We are not celebrating my success today, Dad," I said, "because my success has absolutely nothing to do with this family. I didn't build my company with Anderson money, and I certainly didn't build it with Anderson support. I built it in spite of you. I built it while you were all busy advertising me to your country club friends as your failed experiment." Arthur winced. He had always assumed I couldn't hear the nasty things he said behind my back. He thought I was deaf and blind to the endless slights and insults that defined my entire childhood. "Clara, enough," Arthur muttered, his voice dropping into a low warning register. "Not here. Not in front of everyone. Keep family matters private. You didn't care at all about privacy 5 minutes ago when Aunt Margaret was publicly humiliating me out on that patio," I pointed out, cutting straight through his words. "You didn't care about privacy when you were loudly bragging about Julian and Chloe while treating me like I didn't even exist. The only reason you suddenly care about privacy now is because you are finally the ones being embarrassed." Marcus stepped up beside me, closing her briefcase with a deeply satisfying, solid thud. "All the legal documents have been completely transferred, and the property management team will be contacting you shortly regarding the new ownership agreements. Clara, we have a board call in 20 minutes. We should head to the private suite." I nodded to Marcus, then looked back at my family one last time. The crowd of relatives was completely silent, holding their breath and hanging on to every single word. "Enjoy the vow renewal," I said, raising my voice to make sure everyone on that terrace could hear me, loud and clear. "Please, eat, drink, and take as many photos as you like. The catering for this entire event has already been paid for in full by my company as a courtesy. Treat this estate as your own for the rest of the day, because as of this afternoon, it officially belongs to me." I turned my back on them and walked straight toward the massive double-glass doors of the main house. I didn't look back to see my father's fury or my sister's tears. The sea of relatives parted for me instantly, clearing a path without a word. But I knew the peace wouldn't last. My mother was absolutely not the type to surrender control without a fight. Before I could even cross the threshold into the private suite, I heard the sharp, frantic clicking of her expensive heels rushing across the stone patio behind me. "Clara, you stop right there," my mother's voice barked, cutting through the open glass doors like a whip. I came to a halt in the grand foyer of the main house. Marcus gave me a brief, knowing look and discreetly stepped further down the hallway, giving us some semblance of privacy. I turned around slowly as Eleanor stormed in, her face a barely masked portrait of a pure rage. She grabbed my upper arm, her perfectly manicured nails digging deep into the fabric of my suit jacket, and practically dragged me into a private alcove just off the main hallway. "What do you think you are doing?" she hissed, her voice dropping into a frantic whisper. "You ignore us for an entire year, and then you show up just to pull a stunt like this, buying this property right out from under your brother's syndicate, trying to upstage your sister in the New York social scene with this ridiculous display of wealth. This is low, Clara. This is incredibly petty and vindictive." I looked down at her hand, tightly gripping my arm, then looked back up into her face. "I wasn't trying to upstage anyone, Mother. I simply bought a valuable piece of commercial real estate that my company deemed a smart investment. You were the ones who turned it into a circus." Eleanor let go of my arm, but took a step closer, invading my personal space. She was trying to re-establish the same physical dominance she used over me when I was a child. "Don't play innocent with me," she snapped. "You knew exactly what you were doing. You knew Julian has been trying to secure this property for his investors for the past 6 months. He poured everything into this deal. Today was supposed to be a major victory celebration for him, and you deliberately ruined it just to show off." I let out a short, sharp laugh that echoed in the small alcove. "The only reason Julian dragged this deal out for 6 months and ultimately lost it is because his firm lacked the liquidity to make a competitive offer. The sellers grew tired of waiting for him to scramble for mezzanine financing. They needed a buyer who could close the deal immediately without leveraging outside assets. My company had the cash. We made the offer. That is just business, Mother. It has absolutely nothing to do with upstaging Julian." Eleanor narrowed her eyes. "You have always been consumed by jealousy. Even when you were little, you couldn't stand Julian or Chloe getting any attention. You always had to act out to try and steal the spotlight. And now you're using this new money of yours to punish them for being successful. It is a terrible look, Clara. It makes you look incredibly insecure." The sheer scale of her gaslighting was almost breathtaking. She was actually trying to rewrite the history of the last 20 minutes and the last 35 years, right to my face. "Insecure?" I repeated, my voice steady but dropping an octave. "You want to talk about insecurity? Let's talk about the summer before I went to college. Let's talk about how I earned early admission to MIT for supply chain management entirely on my own merit, and how you and Dad absolutely refused to co-sign my student loans. You told me it was a waste of money because I would probably drop out or fail the advanced math and logistics modeling courses. You said investing in a degree I would never use was too high of a risk." Eleanor waved her hand dismissively, looking away. "We were just being realistic. We didn't want you burdened with hundreds of thousands of dollars in debt if you changed your mind halfway through. We were protecting you." "Protecting me?" I shot back, taking a step forward that forced her to take a half step back. "Just 2 days later, you bought Chloe a brand new Porsche Cayenne in cash as a high school graduation present. You told everyone at the dealership it was a reward for her hard work. She barely maintained a C average, Mother. I was the valedictorian of my class. You didn't refuse my loans to protect me. You refused because you didn't want to invest money in a flawed product. You simply didn't believe I was capable of achieving anything." "That is all ancient history," Eleanor deflected, looking down the hallway. "You are bringing up old grudges just to excuse your terrible behavior today." "It is not ancient history," I said, my voice rising slightly. "It is the absolute foundation of who I am today. You forced me to figure out how to survive on my own. I worked 3 jobs in Boston while carrying a full course load. I slept on a worn-out mattress on the floor of a studio apartment with no heat in the winter. I wrote my first logistics scheduling program on a second-hand laptop from a pawn shop. I had no safety net. I had no family to fall back on." Eleanor crossed her arms over her chest, shifting into a defensive posture. "Well, Look how well you turned out. You should be thanking us. We taught you how to be independent. We gave you the drive to succeed. If we had coddled and spoiled you the way you wanted, you would have never built this company." I stared at her, genuinely stunned by her shameless ability to twist her own cold neglect into a parenting victory. "You don't get to take credit for my survival," I told her coldly. "You threw me into the deep end, hoping I would drown, just so you wouldn't have to deal with the disappointment of raising a child who didn't fit your image. You didn't teach me independence. You taught me that the people who are supposed to love you unconditionally will abandon you the exact second you fail to meet their superficial expectations." She winced, but her pride wouldn't let her back down. "You are being dramatic, Clara. We have always loved you. We just showed it in different ways." "Different ways?" I challenged. "Like when Dad told his old money friends at the country club in the Hamptons that I was just your failed experiment." Eleanor froze completely. The colour drained from her face, leaving her pale and suddenly looking very old. She opened her mouth to speak, but not a single word came out. "I was 16 years old," I continued. "The memory is clear and painful, as if it happened this morning. I was waiting outside the tennis courts for a ride home. Dad was having drinks with the club president and a few other men. One of them asked him why I was so quiet and awkward compared to Julian and Chloe. Dad laughed. He actually laughed and told them I was just an experiment, a rough draft before you finally figured out how to make the perfect children."
"Oh, I didn't know you heard that," Eleanor whispered, her voice barely audible.
"I heard it," I confirmed. "And I didn't just hear it, I carried it with me. I spent years trying to figure out how to fix myself so I wouldn't be the flawed product anymore. I spent years trying to earn even a fraction of the praise you showered on Julian just for existing. But the joke is ultimately on you, Mother, because that flawed product just bought the very ground you're standing on." Eleanor recovered quickly, her survival instincts kicking in. She straightened her posture and smoothed down the front of her expensive coat. "Well," she said, her tone shifting from defensive to business-like shrewdness, "you're angry. You've proved your point. You're very successful now, and you want us to acknowledge that. Consider it acknowledged. Now, let's talk about this estate." She took a step closer, lowering her voice into a conspiratorial whisper, as if we had suddenly become allies. "You can't manage a mass premier luxury resort property from a tech park office, Clara," she said. "You don't understand high-end real estate. You don't know property management or luxury hospitality. Julian's firm specializes in high-asset portfolio management. He has the elite connections to maximize the value of this land. You need to hand the commercial portfolio over to him. You can keep the title, but let him handle day-to-day operations. We can present it to the public as a joint family investment venture." I stared at her, almost admiring her relentless, cold-blooded ambition. Even now, faced with her own cruelty and my undeniable success, her only goal was to find a way to extract value from me and hand it to Julian on a silver platter. She was completely incapable of accepting a reality where I held power over her golden boy. "You want me to hand the management of a $35 million asset over to the brother who just spent 20 minutes trying to prove to everyone that I'm drowning in debt?" I demanded. "You want me to let Julian drain a massive management fee from my investment just so he can keep pretending he's the Wall Street mastermind calling the shots?" "It makes perfect business sense," Eleanor insisted. "It keeps the revenue within the family. It helps Julian's firm show strong assets under management, which he desperately needs right now. And it saves you from the embarrassment of trying to run a property you know nothing about. We can draft the contracts tomorrow. It's the best solution for everyone." I let out a slow breath and shook my head. "You still don't get it, do you? There is no joint family investment venture here. There is no we. There is only me and the company I built with my own hands. Julian isn't touching a single blade of grass on this property. He gets no management fees. He gets no consulting fees. He will not get a single cent from me to prop up his crumbling fake reputation." Eleanor's eyes narrowed, her patience finally snapping. You are making a massive mistake, Clara. You think because you made some money in logistics and tech that you're the smartest person in the room, but you don't understand how things work at this level. You don't understand family legacy. Whether you admit it or not, you need us. You cannot navigate that elite world alone. I've never been alone, I replied, turning toward the hallway where Marcus was waiting patiently. I have a world-class team of professionals who actually respect me. I have a board of directors that values my insight. I built an empire without a single bit of your help, and I will continue to rule it without a single bit of your interference. I stepped out of the alcove, leaving Eleanor standing alone in the shadows. Our conversation is over, Mother. Go back to your party. Enjoy the champagne. And please tell Julian that if he dares to provoke me again regarding my company's finances, I will buy his firm out from under him and personally let him go. I walked down the hallway, my heels clicking decisively against the polished marble floor. Behind me, I heard Eleanor let out a frustrated gasp, the sound of someone who had completely lost control. I didn't look back. I had delivered my message, and I knew she understood it, but I also knew this war was far from over. My family never surrendered easily, and Julian was absolutely not the type to take a humiliation like this lying down. I stepped back out onto the sun-drenched patio, the crisp, rocky mountain air providing a brief relief from the suffocating atmosphere of the main house. Marcus was standing near the grand curved staircase, checking her phone, but her gaze sharpened the moment I appeared. She gave a slight nod, signaling that the private suite was secure and ready for my board meeting. I intended to walk straight past the catering tables and go upstairs, leaving my family to stew in their own shock. But I never got the chance. Julian deliberately stepped directly into my path. He held a freshly poured glass of expensive whiskey, his other hand casually tucked into the pocket of his tailored blue suit. He had carefully positioned himself right in the centre of the terrace, surrounded by Uncle Thomas, Aunt Linda, and several older cousins who had always hung on his every word. He wanted a public circus. He wanted to restore the natural order of the universe, an order where he was the flawless genius and I was the helpless punchline. Well, look who decided to rejoin the adults, Julian announced, his voice deliberately booming to catch the attention of everyone nearby. He smiled, but it was a tight, predatory expression. Mom just told me you had a little tantrum in the hallway over management rights. Let's get something straight right now, Clara. I stopped and looked at him. I didn't cross my arms or shift my weight. I just stood there perfectly calm, watching him dig his own grave.
It's cute that your little logistics startup managed to scrape together a bid for this place, Julian continued, taking a slow, arrogant sip of his drink. But we all know how this game is played. You secured a mezzanine loan by putting up some heavily inflated tech valuation as collateral. You leveraged yourself to the absolute max, and now you're praying every day that the market doesn't correct itself before you figure out what to do with a massive commercial asset. You think buying a premium estate is as simple as writing a line of supply chain code. It isn't.
He took a step forward, trying to use his height to physically intimidate me. The older cousins watched intently, waiting for me to wither under his brilliant financial analysis. Your debt-to-equity ratio right now must be astronomical, Julian sneered, his tone dripping with fake brotherly concern. You're drowning in high-interest liabilities just to make a point at a family reunion. It's a classic liquidity trap. You don't have the working capital to sustain an estate of this magnitude. The property taxes alone here will bankrupt your firm in 2 quarters. I'm trying to save you from your own foolishness, Clara. Transfer the management rights to my firm. We will restructure your debt, stabilize the asset, and prevent you from defaulting. You can keep your name on the deed to make yourself feel important, but let the actual professionals handle the money before you lose everything. He ended his speech with a smug, condescending smirk. He looked over at our father, Arthur, who was standing a few feet away, nodding along with an incredibly solemn expression. Julian truly believed he had just intellectually dismantled me in front of the entire extended family. He believed he had exposed me as a naive amateur playing a dangerous game with fake money. I looked at my brother. I looked at the smug smile on his face and the expensive Patek Philippe on his wrist. My entire life he had used these complex financial buzzwords and superior proclamations to make me feel small. He was the golden boy who could do no wrong, the prodigy destined to conquer Wall Street. "Are you finished, Julian?" I asked. My voice was quiet, but it carried a deadly calm that instantly wiped the smirk right off his face. He scoffed, rattling the ice cubes in his glass. "I'm just giving you a reality check." "Then let's talk about reality," I said, taking a deliberate step toward him. "Let's talk about hard data. You seem to think my company just writes simple package tracking code. We don't. Apex Biologistics secures global medical supply chain infrastructure for institutional investors. We audit distribution networks. We secure trading algorithms. We see the raw data. We see the actual ledgers. I see everything, Julian." I hadn't raised my voice, but the temperature on the patio seemed to drop 10 degrees. Julian blinked, his posture stiffening slightly. "You want to talk about leverage?" I continued, locking my eyes onto his. "Let's look at Vanguard Property Holdings, your firm. Dad was bragging earlier about you becoming a senior partner. The whole family clapped for you. But Vanguard didn't promote you because of your brilliant market strategies, did they?" Julian opened his mouth to speak, but no sound came out. The ice in his glass stopped rattling. "They promoted you because they were desperate for a massive injection of liquidity," I stated, my voice clinical and precise. "Your firm is currently trying to hide a 34% quarterly revenue drop caused by that disastrous commercial real estate default in Chicago last month. A default that you personally managed." Julian froze completely. Every single ounce of colour drained from his face, leaving him looking like a ghost in a designer suit. Uncle Thomas frowned, his eyes darting back and forth between Julian and me. "That is highly confidential company information," Julian stammered, his voice suddenly sounding thin and weak. "You couldn't possibly know that. I know that your client retention rate has plummeted by 19% since January," I continued relentlessly, letting the numbers crash down on the stone patio like heavy stones. "I know 2 of your anchor funds are currently operating at a net loss. I know your personal portfolio is dangerously over-leveraged, tied up in retail spaces that are tanking nationwide. You are hemorrhaging capital, Julian. You are drowning." I took another step forward, invading his personal space the exact way he had always done to me. "You didn't want to manage this estate to save me," I said, each word sharp and crystal clear. "You desperately needed to extract management fees from this property to cover your own margin calls. You needed this asset to prove to your board that you could still bring in revenue. You're exactly 3 weeks away from a catastrophic liquidity crunch, and you saw my acquisition as your personal life raft." The silence on the terrace was absolute. The entire family stared at Julian, waiting for him to laugh it off, waiting for a brilliant, witty comeback. They were waiting for the golden boy to put the ugly duckling back in her place, but Julian just stood there, his mouth opening and closing. A single bead of cold sweat rolled down his temple. He looked at our father in absolute panic, but Arthur was staring back at him with wide, horrified eyes. Arthur knew enough about finance to recognize that the highly specific details I just exposed weren't a guess. He knew I wasn't making it up. "That's a lie," Julian managed to choke out, but his voice cracked on the final word. It sounded pathetic. It sounded like a little boy caught with his hand in the cookie jar. "I never lie, Julian," I said coldly, "and my data never lies. Never try to intimidate me again with the buzzwords you learned in your freshman finance seminars. My company bought this estate in cash, with 0 debt and 0 leverage. I operate with a 9-figure budget that doesn't rely on inflated real estate portfolios or predatory loans. I don't need a bridge loan to survive, and I certainly don't need a failing wealth manager trying to bleed my assets to save his own sinking ship. Julian instinctively stepped back. His shoulders slumped completely, and he stared at the ground, utterly defeated. The brilliant, arrogant older brother had been completely dismantled in less than 3 minutes. I had stripped away his entire identity in front of every single person he cared about, impressing. "Clara, that's enough." Arthur finally stepped in, his voice trembling slightly. He tried to sound authoritative, but he looked terrified. "You've made your point. There's no need to humiliate your brother in front of the whole family." "He started this conversation, Dad," I pointed out, maintaining my calm composure. "He tried to humiliate me publicly to assert his dominance. I simply ended the conversation with accurate data. If the truth humiliates him, that is his failure, not mine." I turned away from my father and brother, brushing an imaginary speck of dust off the sleeve of my custom suit. The relatives remained frozen in place, watching me with a completely new look of deep respect and absolute fear. I hadn't just beaten the golden boy, I had completely destroyed the illusion of his success. Marcus was waiting for me at the bottom of the stairs, a faint smile playing at the corners of her mouth. "Are we ready to head up to the boardroom, Miss Anderson?" Marcus asked, her professional voice carrying clearly across the quiet courtyard. "The executive team is waiting on the secure line." "Yes, Marcus, let's go," I replied. "I've wasted enough time here." I walked right past my stunned family, leaving Julian staring blankly at his shoes, and my father looking like his entire world had just collapsed. As I walked up the grand curved staircase of the estate I now owned, I felt lighter than I had in 35 years. The financial intimidation tactics had completely backfired. The Anderson family hierarchy was officially dead, and I was the one holding the shovel. 2 hours later, I wrapped up my board meeting in the estate's master suite. Marcus packed her laptop into her leather briefcase and gave me a rare, genuinely appreciative look. She told me the catering team had set up the formal dinner on the mountain terrace, and that while I was upstairs, a miraculous shift had occurred in my family's overall attitude. I thanked her and walked down the grand staircase alone. I knew exactly what was waiting for me at the bottom. Predators never surrender when they are disarmed. They simply change their disguise and wait for a better angle to strike. The moment I stepped onto the wide stone terrace, the atmosphere had shifted dramatically. The tense, panicked whispers from earlier were completely gone. My mother, Eleanor, practically sprinted across the stone patio to greet me. The furious, pale mask she wore hours ago was replaced by a wide, beaming smile of pure maternal affection. "Clara, darling," she sang out, her voice dripping with a sickening artificial sweetness. She reached out and tightly grabbed both of my hands, squeezing them hard. "We've been waiting for you to start dinner. You absolutely must see what I did with the seating arrangements." Before I could pull my hands away, she locked her arm in mine and paraded me through the crowd of aunts, uncles, and cousins. The extended family parted like the Red Sea, offering stiff, nervous smiles. Eleanor led me directly to the massive mahogany dining table, which was beautifully lit by strings of lights and set with fine bone china and crystal stemware. She brought me straight to the head of the table, the seat of honor, the exact seat that, ever since I was born, had belonged exclusively to my father, Arthur, at every Thanksgiving, Christmas, and summer gathering. "Sit here, sweetheart," Eleanor insisted, pulling out the heavy carved chair with a dramatic flourish. "The guest of honor deserves the perfect view of the snowy Rockies tonight." I looked down at the elaborate place card. She had literally taken a pen, crossed out Arthur's name, and written mine in elegant cursive. My father was now sitting directly to my right, looking incredibly stiff, but forcing a highly strained, welcoming smile. Julian sat further down the table, staring intensely at his empty porcelain plate. He looked like a man walking to his own undoing, but he remained silent. I sat down slowly, placing my hands flat on the linen tablecloth. The sudden pivot in their strategy was so predictable it was almost insulting. They realized that open intimidation and gaslighting had completely failed. Now they were trying to smother me with fake affection, imagining I was still that desperate, lonely little girl who would trade her soul and her bank account for a few crumbs of maternal validation. Before I could even unfold my napkin, my sister Chloe rushed over. She pulled a chair incredibly close to my left side. The limited edition Patek Philippe she had been flaunting all afternoon was deliberately turned inward, hidden from the light. Her eyes were already filling with heavy, manufactured tears. She reached out her perfectly manicured hand and placed it directly over mine. "Clara," Chloe whispered, her voice carrying a heavy, dramatic tremble. "I'm just so happy we are finally sitting together again. It feels like it's been a lifetime since we really talked." I looked at her hand resting on the sleeve of my custom suit, then looked up into her tear-filled eyes. "We sat at this exact same table 3 years ago for Thanksgiving, Chloe," I replied calmly. "And during that entire meal, you spent the whole time talking to Julian about your luxury trip to Dubai, and you told me my sweater looked like a uniform from a discount retail store." Chloe let out a broken, trembling laugh, a perfect tear rolling down her cheek. "I was so immature back then," she cried softly. "You have to forgive me. I've just missed my big sister so much." She leaned in closer, wrapping her arms around my shoulders in a suffocating, perfume-heavy hug. "Seeing you stand up to Julian today made me realize how much I look up to you. You're so strong, Clara. I want us to be incredibly close again. I want you to be a massive part of my life and a massive part of my upcoming Hamptons gala. We need to be a real family again." I didn't hug her back. I sat there as stiff as a stone until she finally pulled away, gently dabbing the corners of her eyes with a white linen napkin to protect her flawless makeup. It was a masterclass in acting. If I didn't know for a fact that she had spent the last 10 years mocking my career and telling all her high society friends that I was a hopeless failure, I might have actually believed her. But I saw the sharp, calculating glint hidden right behind her wet eyelashes. She was setting the stage. They all were. The catering staff came forward to serve the first course, and the dinner conversation completely focused on me. Aunts and uncles who had actively ignored my existence for years suddenly developed a deep interest in my biologistics network. Uncle Thomas asked for my expert opinion on emerging medical tech stocks. Aunt Margaret, the exact same woman who had loudly called me an ugly duckling hours earlier, kept offering to pour my wine and complimenting the perfect tailoring of my suit. It was a suffocating, endless bombardment of flattery. Eleanor kept interrupting anyone else who spoke to ensure the spotlight remained locked firmly on me. She acted as though my monumental success was the direct result of her brilliant, nurturing guidance. "Clara has always possessed an incredibly focused mind," Eleanor announced loudly to the table, waving her silver fork. While other girls her age were distracted by silly, trivial things, Clara was building her future. Arthur and I always knew she was destined for greatness. We gave her the space to independently thrive, and look how beautifully that has paid off. I ate my salad without saying a word, letting them weave their elaborate web of lies. I knew a trap was being set. I could see Arthur exchanging meaningful looks across the table with Julian and Eleanor. They were treating me exactly like a wealthy angel investor they needed to soften up before delivering a massive corporate pitch. When the main course was cleared and expensive champagne was poured into fresh glasses, Arthur stood up. He took his crystal flute and tapped it gently with a silver spoon. The crisp, ringing sound instantly silenced the terrace. Every relative turned their full attention to the patriarch of the Anderson family. Arthur stood tall, smiling down at me. His eyes were completely cold and calculating, but his voice projected the warm, booming joy of a deeply proud father. "If I could take just a moment of your time," Arthur began, raising his glass high. "Today has been a day of incredible surprises and wonderful discoveries. For years, this family has proudly celebrated the many milestones of Julian and Chloe. But today, we celebrate our daughter who has returned to the fold. Today, we celebrate Clara. Polite, enthusiastic applause rippled around the long table. I didn't move a single muscle. Clara has proven beyond a shadow of a doubt that she possesses the true Anderson spirit. Arthur continued, his voice rising with dramatic pride. She has firmly established herself in the competitive world of business. She may have been a late bloomer, but the financial success she has achieved is frankly beyond anything we anticipated, and with great capability comes great responsibility. The absolute foundation of the Anderson legacy has always been unity. We protect our own. We lift up our own. Blood is always thicker than water. He took a dramatic, calculated pause, looking around the table to make sure everyone was hanging on his every word. He was leveraging the entire extended family, using the ultimate public social pressure to back me into a corner. That is why I am incredibly proud to announce that Clara has generously agreed to step up and fulfill her responsibility to this family, Arthur declared, his booming voice sweeping across the mountain terrace. As her very first act as the new owner of this magnificent estate, Clara will be making a major capital injection to stabilize Julian's commercial real estate syndicate, securing his partnership and ensuring our family's professional reputation remains completely unblemished in the market. Julian looked up, offering a stiff, forced smile to the cheering relatives. He looked like he wanted to throw up from needing such a pathetic lifeline, but he played along with the theatre perfectly. But that is not all, Arthur proclaimed, his smile growing even wider, showing all his teeth as he looked straight at me. Clara has also insisted on giving her sister the ultimate gift. To celebrate Chloe's upcoming charity gala in the Hamptons, Clara will be fully funding the launch of Chloe's personal health and lifestyle brand. This is a $2 million endowment to ensure her little sister has the magical life she truly deserves. Chloe let out a loud, dramatic gasp, covering her mouth with both hands. She looked at me with wide, glittering eyes, acting completely shocked by an announcement she had clearly helped write. "Clara, you really shouldn't have," Chloe cried, her voice floating perfectly through the cold mountain air. "This is too much. I can't accept this." "Nonsense," Eleanor interjected immediately, leaning over to pat my hand with aggressive affection. "Your sister wants to do this for you, Chloe. This is her way of making up for lost time. Now that she is in a position to contribute, this is how she finally becomes a true central part of this family." Arthur raised his champagne glass even higher, to Clara, for finally stepping up and doing the right thing for her family. To Clara! The extended family echoed in unison, raising their glasses in perfect synchronization. They all took a sip, looking at me with expectant, beaming smiles, waiting for me to bow my head, accept my newly cast role as their personal ATM, and start signing the checks. They had cornered me in front of 50 relatives, fully believing that the fear of public embarrassment and the dread of ruining a beautiful family toast would force me to comply. They thought heavy social pressure was a cage I couldn't escape. 他们大错特错了. They were dead wrong. I didn't even touch my champagne glass. I let the echoes of their joyful cheers fade into the cold wind. 50 expectant faces stared at me, waiting for a tearful speech of gratitude and compliance. They believed they had used social etiquette to trap me in a corner where I had no choice but to give in. I sat in my seat for a long, deeply meaningful moment, staring directly at my father. Then, with the sharp, harsh scrape of the chair against the stone ground, I stood up. "Thank you for that imaginative piece of pure fiction, Dad," I said. My voice wasn't loud, but the complete lack of emotion in it cut through the festive atmosphere like a scalpel. However, allow me to make a small correction for the official record. I will not be investing a single dollar into Julian's failing company, and I am absolutely not funding a $2 million vanity brand for Chloe. The silence that slammed down on the patio was absolute. It was so quiet I could hear the logs crackling in the fireplace. I scanned the faces of the extended family, making sure my voice carried to the very furthest tables. Since we are sharing announcements tonight, let me make things absolutely clear. My company purchased this estate because it is an excellent commercial asset. That's where my financial involvement with this family begins, and that is exactly where it ends. I'm not a bank. I am not a bailout fund. And I am absolutely not paying a late admission fee to beg for acceptance from people who spent my entire life pretending I didn't exist. A collective gasp rippled through the aunts and uncles gathered around the table. Chloe was the first to drop the act. The fake trembling of her lower lip stopped instantly, twisting into an incredibly ugly sneer. "You can't do this," Chloe screamed, slamming her palm onto the table and rattling the silverware. "Dad just told everyone you were investing in my brand. You can't just back out and humiliate us in front of the entire family." "I can't back out of an agreement I never made, Chloe," I replied calmly. "You and Dad fabricated a script in the hallway, trying to force me onto a stage to read lines you wrote. The show is cancelled." Eleanor snapped up from her chair, her face turning a deep purple. Her elegant hostess persona evaporated in a second, replaced by the vicious bully I had known my entire life. "How dare you!" Eleanor screamed, her finger shaking as she pointed at me. "How dare you sit at my table and show such disrespect to this family? We gave you everything. We welcomed you back with open arms, and this is how you repay us? By humiliating your brother and destroying your sister's dreams? You're the exact same selfish, ungrateful girl you've always been." I didn't flinch. The venom in her voice was so familiar it was almost comforting. This was the truth. The fake sweet coating from earlier was disgusting, but this raw, out-of-control hatred was real. "You didn't welcome me back, Mother," I corrected her. "You welcomed my bank account. You thought you could flatter me into submission. But I am no longer that insecure teenager desperate for your approval. I see exactly what you're doing." Arthur stepped closer to me, puffing out his chest, his hands clenched into fists at his sides. "You listen to me, you arrogant little girl," he growled, saliva flying from his lips. "You think because you made some money in logistics you can look down on the Anderson name? We shaped you. We gave you the drive to succeed. If you don't write those checks right now, you are no longer a part of this family. We will completely cut you off." I laughed. It was a genuine, deeply amused laugh. "You cut me off 15 years ago, Dad. You advertised me as an experiment to your country club friends. You refused to co-sign my student loans. You cannot threaten to take away something you never gave me in the first place." Julian, who had been sitting in dark silence, finally stood up. He buttoned his suit jacket, trying to project an air of superiority, but his face was already slick with sweat. He pointed an accusing finger across the table. "You know what your problem is, Clara?" Julian sneered, his voice dripping with condescension. "You are malicious. You've always been malicious because you're a flawed individual. You have all this money, but you absolutely have no life. You have no husband. You have no family. You sit all alone in some sterile penthouse hoarding cash because nobody actually wants you. You're a lonely, pathetic person taking her bitter jealousy out on her sister because Chloe is truly beautiful and deeply loved." Chloe eagerly jumped on the attack, emboldened by Julian. "She's just jealous," Chloe chimed in, tossing her hair over her shoulder. "She knows she could never get a man like Liam. She knows no man from a respectable family would ever look at her. She's trying to ruin my career because she knows she'll never have one of her own. You're pathetic, Clara. You think money makes you powerful, but you're still just the defective product we all pity." The insults rained down exactly like they did when I was a child. They attacked my appearance, my relationship status, my charm. They reverted to the most superficial measures of worth because that was the only currency they understood. To them, a woman's value was entirely dictated by her ability to secure a wealthy husband and maintain a perfect social image. They truly believed that reminding me of my social shortcomings would break my spirit and force me to comply. The relatives around the table shifted uncomfortably. A few older aunts looked away, clearly embarrassed by the pure malice displayed by my parents and siblings, but not a single person spoke up for me. They never did. The golden rule of the Anderson family was to never cross Arthur and Eleanor. I let them rave. I stood there, hands casually clasped in front of me, maintaining perfect eye contact with each of them as they spewed their poison. I didn't raise my voice. I didn't cry. I didn't show an ounce of vulnerability. I just watched them exhaust their limited vocabulary of insults. I let the extended family witness the incredibly ugly reality of the golden children and the perfect parents. When Julian finally ran out of breath and Chloe stopped shouting about her ruined socialite dreams, the terrace fell quiet again. They stared at me, panting, waiting for me to break. They expected me to run away in tears, just like I did when I was 16. Instead, I reached into the inside pocket of my custom suit jacket. "Are you all finished?" I asked. My voice was calm, cold, and completely unbothered. Eleanor crossed her arms, her eyes narrowing with absolute hatred. "You are a sociopath," she hissed. "You have no feelings. You don't care about anyone but yourself." "I care deeply about the truth, Mother," I replied. "And I care deeply about avoiding terrible investments. Julian just accused me of hoarding money. He claims I'm a lonely person, taking my jealousy out on the family. But I'm not hoarding money. I simply refuse to throw it into a bottomless black hole." I pulled a heavy document envelope from my jacket. It was sealed with red, tamper-evident tape. I held it up for a moment, letting the overhead lights catch the bright red seal. "Do you see this, Dad?" I continued, turning my gaze back to Arthur. "You demanded that I bail out Julian's firm. You stood in front of 50 relatives and declared it my family responsibility to protect the Anderson reputation and save his partnership. You spun it as a simple temporary market fluctuation, something a good sister should help her brother move past."
Arthur raised his chin, his jaw tight. "It is a temporary cash flow issue," he maintained stubbornly. "Vanguard Property Holdings is a top-tier firm. Your brother is an excellent manager. He just needs a bridge to the next quarter."
I nodded slowly, walking toward the center of the massive dining table. A bridge to the next quarter. That is a very creative way to put it. I stopped directly in front of Arthur and Eleanor. Julian was standing just a few feet away, his face suddenly turning incredibly pale.
I placed the heavy envelope flecked on the centre of the linen tablecloth. The dull thud of the paper hitting the wood underneath echoed in the tense silence.
"I'm absolutely not bailing Julian out, Dad," I said, my voice carrying clearly to everyone on the terrace, "and you are all about to understand exactly why." I snapped the red tamper tape with my thumb. The sharp rip sounded incredibly loud in the cold mountain air. Every single eye at the table locked onto my hands. Julian suddenly took a sharp step forward, his hands reaching out as if to snatch the envelope. But Marcus stepped smoothly between us. Her presence alone was enough to freeze him in his tracks. I pulled a thick stack of printed spreadsheets from the envelope, fanning them out across the white linen. They were filled with highlighted rows, red ink, and bold corporate bank routing numbers. "I told you earlier that Apex Logistics defends global medical supply chains for institutional clients," I began, keeping my tone conversational but incredibly authoritative. "What I didn't mention is that our core expertise is deep forensic data auditing. We don't just build firewalls. We track hidden financial anomalies for federal regulators and institutional investors. When my company prepared to acquire the holding group that currently carries your firm's debt, my chief engineers performed a completely routine mandatory deep dive into the underlying asset portfolios. We lifted up the digital floorboards. We traced every single wire transfer, every offshore routing number, and every hidden LLC tied to Vanguard Property Holdings." My father, Arthur, frowned deeply. His thick eyebrows knitted together as he tried to follow my train of thought. "Audit," he said, his voice tightening. "You ran an unauthorized audit on your brother's company." That is corporate espionage, Clara. Before this night is over, I will personally have you arrested." I didn't even look at him. Marcus completely took over the question. "Actually, Arthur," Marcus declared, her voice echoing with absolute legal authority. This audit was a completely legal and mandatory corporate due diligence process performed prior to the acquisition of distressed debt. Every piece of information in these files was obtained through perfectly lawful corporate transparency clauses. Clauses that Julian himself signed with his own hand last year when he put up his company's assets as collateral for a mezzanine loan. Julian looked like he was about to pass out. He gripped the back of an empty dining chair so hard his knuckles turned completely white. He opened his mouth, but his chest was heaving so violently that he couldn't form a single word. I picked up the first stack of papers and held it up. "Do you see this, Dad? Julian isn't facing a temporary liquidity issue. A liquidity issue means money is tied up in slow-moving assets like commercial real estate or long-term bonds. But Vanguard Holdings has no slow-moving assets. Vanguard Holdings has zero assets, because for the past 4 years, Julian has been systematically and frantically misappropriating tens of millions of dollars from his own clients' trust accounts." The accusation dropped on the table like a live grenade. Aunt Margaret let out a loud gasp, her hand flying to her pearl necklace. Uncle Thomas, the paediatrician who had been so friendly to me earlier, pushed his chair back from the table, his face a mask of pure horror. "That's a lie!" Julian screamed, his voice completely cracking. He lunged toward the table, but my father threw out an arm to hold him back, Arthur's own face stricken with a sudden terrifying realization. He knew enough about the specific details I was throwing out to know I wasn't guessing. "You altered those documents, Clara. You forged the data to frame me because you are a jealous, vindictive psychopath." I tossed the papers back onto the table and tapped a highlighted row with my index finger. $15 million, I read aloud, clearly and precisely. Wire transferred on October 12th of last year from Vanguard client escrow account to a shell company registered in the Cayman Islands. A shell company that happens to handle money routing for a massive, unauthorized offshore sports betting operation. I picked up another sheet. February 3rd of this year, $3 million wired directly to a high-stakes private poker room in Macau, and another $6 million in April sent to a cryptocurrency exchange known for clearing gambling debts. I can keep going, Julian. I have 40 pages of this. I stared directly into my brother's terrified eyes. You are no financial prodigy, Julian. You're a compulsive gambler who used your clients' retirement funds as your personal casino chips. You lost tens of millions of dollars that didn't belong to you, and when the margin calls came, you stole more to try and cover your tracks. You aren't facing a bad quarter. You are facing 20 years in a federal facility for severe wire fraud. A devastating silence followed. Nobody breathed. The howling mountain wind felt deafening. Arthur turned his head slowly to look at his golden boy. His face had turned an ashen grey. The patriarch, who had just proudly raised a glass to his son's genius, was now staring at a criminal. "Julian," Arthur whispered, his voice trembling. "Julian, tell me she made this up. Tell me right now this is a lie." Julian couldn't even look him in the eye. The brilliant, arrogant older brother, who had spent his entire life making me feel stupid, stared dead at the stone patio, tears streaming down his face. He was shaking violently, and his perfect custom suit suddenly looked like a costume he had stolen. But I wasn't finished. The dissection wasn't complete. I reached into the envelope and pulled out the second stack of papers. These were marked with bright yellow highlighter. I turned my attention to my sister. Chloe was clutching the arm of her venture capitalist husband, Liam, her eyes wide with shock as she watched her brother's ruin. She thought she was safe. She thought she was just a spectator to Julian's downfall. She was dead wrong. "Now, Chloe," I said, my voice shifting into a sharp, lethal rhythm. "You had a lot of opinions earlier about my pathetic life. You called me a lonely spinster. You bragged about your lavish charity gala, your designer clothes, and how you were the beautiful one who deserved to be pampered. Chloe swallowed hard, shrinking back slightly against her husband. "Leave me out of this," she stammered. "I don't know anything about Julian's business. I'm not involved in this." "You are involved deeper than anyone," I corrected smoothly, because losing at the poker tables was only half of Julian's problem. The other half was you. I slid the yellow highlighted pages across the white linen, stopping them right in front of her place setting. Chloe stared at the documents, refusing to touch them. "Let's talk about your perfect lifestyle," I continued. "The one that proved you were so superior to me. 3 years ago, Dad's company had a massive cash flow crisis. We all know that. But what you didn't know is that Mum and Dad completely drained their liquid cash to fund your vanity projects. They couldn't afford your tens of thousands of dollars in wardrobe updates, your first-class flights to Dubai, or the rent on your luxury penthouse in Manhattan." Eleanor let out a sharp, choking sound. She tried to step forward to stop me, but Marcus shot her a warning look that pinned her to her seat. "But you couldn't bear to look poor, Chloe," I said, raising my voice to ensure every relative heard every single word. "You couldn't stand the thought of your high society friends realizing that Andersons were struggling. So you went to Julian, crying about needing to maintain appearances, and Julian, wanting to play the protective, highly successful older brother, decided to help you." I tapped the yellow highlighted papers. Over the past 36 months, Julian funneled approximately $3 million of misappropriated client funds directly into your lifestyle brand. He categorized it as consulting fees for marketing services you never provided, and you used your brand to clear the dirty money, turning it into your personal pocket cash. Chloe's husband, Liam, the tech entrepreneur, physically ripped his arm away from her grasp, taking a massive step backward. He looked at the documents on the table, then looked at Chloe with a look of absolute disgust. "You paid for your lavish charity gala and your entire existence with stolen retirement funds, Chloe," I stated coldly. "The designer dress you're wearing, the elite catering we are eating, and every luxury item you flaunt was bought with stolen money. You are no high society princess, Chloe. You are an accessory to federal wire fraud." "That's not true," Chloe screamed, her voice dissolving into a hysterical wail. She snatched the documents, flipping through them frantically. "I didn't know where the money came from. Julian told me it was from his personal trust. He told me it was his bonus. I didn't know it was stolen." "Liam, please, you have to believe me." She turned to grab her husband's arm again, but Liam held up his hands, backing away into the crowd of relatives. "Don't touch me," Liam said, his voice thick with absolute revulsion. "My funds and my board rely on absolute transparency. If you've been living off misappropriated cash, my investors will have my head. I'm out. I'm completely out." Liam turned on his heel and walked straight off the terrace, heading toward the estate's gates without looking back once. Chloe let out a primal, panicked shriek. "Liam, wait! Liam!" She gathered the skirt of her expensive designer gown and ran after him frantically, her heels clicking wildly against the stone.
But he didn't even slow down. The beautiful sister, the one who had built her entire identity on securing a wealthy husband, was left exposed and abandoned in the freezing cold, weeping hysterically.
I stood there completely calm, watching the collapse unfold. I felt no pity. I felt no remorse. They had spent my entire life building pedestals out of cruelty and vanity. All I did was remove the support beams. I turned my gaze back to the head of the table. Julian had collapsed into his chair, burying his face in his hands, weeping openly in front of the very aunts and uncles who had idolized him for decades. The brilliant illusion was completely shattered, leaving behind nothing but a desperate offender waiting for the federal indictments to drop. My mother, Eleanor, gripped the edge of the table, hyperventilating. Her chest heaved violently as she stared at the ruins of her perfect family. In less than 10 minutes, Her golden children had been completely brought down by the weight of their own choices. But the dissection still wasn't over. I'd saved the most devastating piece of data for the one who truly deserved it. Reaching into the envelope one last time, I pulled out a single thin sheet of paper. This one wasn't highlighted. It was a cold, simple legal contract bearing 2 very specific signatures. I looked at my father. He was staring blankly into space, looking like a man who had just witnessed the end of his world. He thought the worst was behind him. He thought embezzlement and a ruined marriage were the absolute bottom of the abyss. He was dead wrong. I held that thin piece of paper in my hand, but the explosion around the table required immediate attention. Before I could even present this final piece of evidence, the fragile dam holding my family together broke completely. The illusion of the perfect Anderson family evaporated in real time, replaced by the bitter, ugly truth of who they really were. Arthur suddenly slammed both hands onto the linen tablecloth. Expensive crystal glasses rattled and tipped over, deep red liquid soaking into the white fabric like spilled blood. He didn't look at me. He turned his entire body toward Julian, his face twisted into a mask of pure, unadulterated rage. "You stole from our clients," Arthur roared, his booming voice no longer joyful, but weaponized. "You embezzled from trust accounts. Do you have any idea what you've done? You have completely destroyed the Anderson name." Julian winced, flinching backward so hard his chair scraped violently against the stone patio. But the terror in his eyes quickly mutated into a backed-into-a-corner, desperate fury. The golden boy who had never taken accountability for a single mistake in 38 years was suddenly facing total ruin, and he absolutely refused to go down alone. "Don't you dare play innocent with me," Julian screamed back, gesturing wildly. "You pushed me into this. You forced me into real estate development and high-leverage financing. You sat at the country club, bragging about my returns, demanding double-digit growth every single quarter. When the market turned, you told me to figure it out or get out of the way. You told me winners never show weakness. I didn't tell you to be a thief," Arthur bellowed, taking a menacing step toward his son. "You gambled away tens of millions. You threw our family reputation away at the poker tables. I was covering margin calls," Julian shouted hysterically, his voice breaking completely. "I needed liquidity fast. If I admitted the firm was losing money, you would have cut me off the exact same way you cut off Clara. I saw what you did to her. I knew what happened to the children who disappointed you. I was not going to be the failure of this family." The confession hung heavily in the freezing night air. Julian had just admitted that the driving force behind his massive federal crimes was the paralyzing fear of disappointing his father. The toxic perfectionism Arthur had cultivated had directly bred a desperate criminal. Before Arthur could respond, a sharp, piercing wail cut through the courtyard. Chloe was back. She stumbled onto the terrace, looking like a broken porcelain doll. The hem of her custom gown was covered in dirt. Her perfect hair was a wind-blown mess, and thick black streaks of running mascara stained her cheeks. She marched straight up to Julian, her hands clenched into fists. "He's gone!" she shrieked, her voice raw and scraping. Liam got in his car and drove away. He called his attorney from the driveway. "The marriage is over. You ruined my life, Julian." Chloe lunged at her brother, her fists pounding wildly against his chest. Julian shoved her away roughly, nearly knocking her to the ground. The rules of high society etiquette were completely gone. They were acting like wild animals. "I ruined your life," Julian spat, his face contorted with disgust. "I funded your life. I paid for your vanity. You demanded tens of thousands of dollars for shopping sprees to impress Liam's mother. You cried to me that you couldn't be seen in the same designer gown twice. You bled me dry, Chloe. You were a parasite. You told me it was trust fund money," Chloe screamed back through her tears. You told me you were making tens of millions. You lied to me. Chloe turned her venomous gaze toward our father. And you, she shouted, her finger trembling violently as she pointed at Arthur. You told me I had to land a wealthy husband. You told me my only job was to be beautiful and marry into old money. You pushed me to keep up with Liam's family. You told me to win no matter what it cost. This is all your fault. Don't you dare blame your son's crimes on me. I provided everything for this family, Arthur roared, his face turning a dangerous shade of crimson. Everything. The shouting escalated into a deafening, chaotic roar. The three of them stood in the center of the patio, tearing each other apart without mercy. They hurled insults, dragged up years of resentment, and viciously attacked each other's deepest vulnerabilities. The glamorous elite family that had spent decades looking down on the rest of the world was reduced to a brutal street fight. I watched the golden children, the ones who were supposed to be better, smarter, and more deserving of everything, completely and utterly destroy each other. Eleanor remained frozen near the head of the table, clutching her pearl necklace and hyperventilating. She watched her perfect husband, her genius son, and her beautiful daughter collapse in a massive public meltdown. She couldn't handle the destruction of her carefully curated narrative. She desperately needed a scapegoat. She needed someone to blame for the fire burning down her house. She turned on me, her eyes wild and completely unhinged. You did this, Eleanor shrieked. She lunged toward me, her face a mask of pure hatred. You came here to destroy us. You engineered this entire night just to tear this family apart. You're a monster, Clara. I didn't step back. I didn't raise my voice. I just looked at her with a profound, hollow pity. I didn't force Julian to steal money, Mother, I replied, my voice projecting a calm, steady authority over the chaos. I didn't force Chloe to live off misappropriated funds. I didn't force Dad to value status over integrity. I didn't start the fire. I just turned on the lights so everyone could finally see the rats in the cellar. Eleanor let out a frustrated, strangled cry. She raised her hand as if to strike me, but Marcus smoothly stepped to my side. A silent physical warning that any physical contact would result in immediate law enforcement intervention. Eleanor's hand dropped, and she buried her face in her palms, sobbing uncontrollably. I walked slowly back to my chair at the head of the table. I sat down, smoothing the skirt of my custom suit. Reaching out, I picked up my crystal glass and took a slow, deliberate sip of the expensive vintage wine. I leaned back and simply watched the fire burn. 35 years of enduring their toxic dynamics were self-consuming right in front of me. Julian was now on his knees on the stone, weeping openly and begging Arthur to hire a top defense attorney. Arthur was shouting back, swearing he wouldn't spend a single dime of his own money to keep a thief out of accountability. Chloe sat on the ground, rocking back and forth, mourning her ruined reputation and the social exile waiting for her in New York. The rest of the extended family watched in paralyzed horror. These were the aunts, uncles, and cousins who had enabled my parents for decades. They had happily attended the lavish parties, eaten the expensive food, and chosen to look the other way every single time my parents humiliated me. They were complicit in the collective delusion that the Andersons were modern royalty. Now they were seeing the rot underneath the gold leaf. Aunt Margaret, the woman who had called me an ugly duckling hours ago, shrank back against a stone pillar. Her body was visibly shaking as she clutched her purse tightly to her chest. She caught me calmly drinking my wine at the head of the table and looked away instantly, terrified that I would turn my attention to her next. Uncle Thomas gently took his wife by the arm and began quietly moving toward the exit. Several other cousins followed suit. They were desperately abandoning the sinking ship, eager to distance themselves from the radioactive fallout of federal crimes and embezzlement. High society doesn't stand by you when the shadow of an investigation looms. They scatter like mice. My mother collapsed into her chair, burying her face in her arms, weeping out loud. "My family," she wailed over and over. "My beautiful, perfect family. It's all gone. Everything is destroyed." She still couldn't see the truth. She was mourning the collapse of an illusion, not reality. She didn't care that her son was a criminal or that her daughter was an accomplice. She only cared about what the people at the country club would think. She only cared that she could never hold her head high at a charity gala again. I sat in the seat of honour, surrounded by their shattered pride. I felt no guilt. I felt no remorse. I had spent a lifetime starving for their love, while they feasted on my self-esteem. They had always demanded my compliance and expected my silence. But silence is a funny thing. When you force someone to be quiet for decades, they use that time to listen. They use that time to observe. They use that time to gather every single piece of data required to dismantle the very people keeping them in the dark, with absolute precision. I set my glass back down on the table. The crystal made a sharp clink that instantly caught my father's attention. Arthur stopped yelling at Julian and looked at me. His chest heaved violently, and cold sweat covered his face. He looked utterly defeated. He thought the punishment was over. He thought the absolute worst had already happened. The embezzlement exposed, the golden boy heading to prison, the perfect daughter socially erased, and the extended family fleeing the estate in droves. What else could possibly be taken from them? He didn't know about the thin piece of paper still resting under my left hand. He didn't know that the true depths of his own downfalls had not yet been exposed to the light. I looked at Arthur, letting a cold, sharp smile spread across my face. The golden children had been completely destroyed by their own greed, but the architects of this toxic empire still had to pay for their own actions. It was time to deal with the parents. I slid the final piece of paper out from under my hand. The stark white document seemed to glow against the dark wood of the table. Arthur panted heavily. He tried to steady himself, attempting to piece his shattered dignity back together. He wiped the sweat from his forehead, looking at me with a pathetic attempt at fatherly pleading. "Clara," he said, his voice trembling but trying to sound reasonable. "You've proved your point. Your brother is a disgrace. We had absolutely no idea he was doing this. Your mother and I are victims here too. We trusted him. We gave him everything. And he ruined us. Please put those papers away. Let's handle this internally as a family before any authorities get involved. We need to do damage control." I didn't hand the paper to him. I didn't even look at him. I looked at Marcus, who was standing a few feet away. Marcus nodded sharply, her expression hardening into absolute legal severity. She took a step forward, standing directly beside my chair at the head of the table. "You are not a victim here, Arthur," Marcus stated clearly, her voice cutting through the cold mountain air. "And you certainly didn't just find out about Julian's embezzlement today." Arthur froze completely. Eleanor stopped crying, snapping her head up, her eyes darting wildly between the attorney and me. "What are you talking about?" Eleanor asked, her voice cracking. "We just found out. You just told us." I shook my head slowly, tapping my index finger on the thin piece of paper.
You see, Mom, for the past decade, I've been building digital security networks. My company thrives on tracking highly hidden data trails. When we audited Vanguard Holdings, we didn't just find Julian's offshore transfers. We found internal communications. We recovered highly secure encrypted emails sent from your personal home network to Julian's private servers.
I picked up the document. 6 months ago, Dad, you noticed a massive discrepancy in the firm's quarterly tax filings. You confronted Julian. You demanded to know where the money went. And Julian, terrified of your rage, confessed everything to you. He told you about the gambling. He told you about the missing tens of millions. He told you that regulatory auditors were scheduled for a mandatory review by the end of the year, and that if the money wasn't replaced, he was going to a federal facility. Arthur's mouth opened, but no sound came out. The few remaining relatives on the patio let out a shocked gasp. "You knew all along," I said, staring directly into my father's terrified eyes. Both of you knew 6 months ago that your golden boy was a federal offender. But instead of reporting him, instead of holding him accountable, you decided to cover it up. You decided to play the protective parents. But the most absurd part is, you didn't want to sell this beautiful resort estate to pay off his debts. You didn't want to liquidate your own retirement accounts. You didn't want to sacrifice your country club lifestyle, your luxury cars, or your precious social status. I leaned forward, resting my elbows on the table. You desperately needed tens of millions in liquid cash to quietly replace the stolen trust funds, but you absolutely refused to pay for it yourselves. So you started looking around for the perfect scapegoat, someone you could sacrifice without a second thought. Eleanor let out a sharp, piercing wail, clutching her chest. Clara, please, don't do this. We were desperate. We were just trying to save our son. You were just trying to save your own pride, I corrected her harshly. And the solution you came up with was to completely destroy me. Marcus stepped forward again, pointing at the document in my hand. 35 years ago, when Clara was born, her grandfather established a small commercial trust in her name. It was a very modest warehouse, located in a Newark logistics hub. Over the decades, the value of that property skyrocketed. It carries zero debt and is entirely legally registered under Clara's name and social security number. I held up the document so Arthur could clearly see his own forged signature at the bottom. 2 weeks ago, Dad, you went to a private financial firm specializing in high-interest mezzanine loans. Using your status as the original executor of that childhood trust, a status that, by the way, legally expired the day I turned 18, you quietly applied for a massive mortgage against my corporate property. You tried to use my perfect credit score, my social security number, and my personal assets as collateral to secure a $15 million loan. The dead silence on the terrace was deafening. Even Julian, who had been hiding his face in his hands, looked up in total shock. He knew his parents were trying to raise money, but he clearly had no idea whose life they were planning to steal to do it. You forged my signature, Dad, I said, my voice dropping to a dangerous whisper. You and Mum conspired to settle me with $15 million of high-interest debt. You planned to quietly wire that money into Vanguard Holdings to cover Julian's track. You were completely willing to wipe out my credit, drive me into foreclosure, and tie my name to a fraudulent loan forever, just to keep your golden boy out of accountability. Arthur's face turned completely ashen. He shook his head mechanically. I was going to pay it back, he stammered. I was going to cover the monthly payments myself. I just needed your credit profile because the banks wouldn't lend to me with my current debt ratios. I was never going to let you default, Clara. I swear I was going to handle it. You committed identity theft and bank fraud, I stated coldly, completely ignoring his pathetic excuses. You tried to financially ruin the daughter you spent decades calling a failure, just to save the son who actually is one. You unilaterally decided that my life, my future, and my security were acceptable collateral as long as it kept the Anderson name out of the tabloids. Eleanor lunged forward, gripping the edge of the table. She sobbed hysterically, her makeup completely ruined. We had no choice, she wailed. Julian was going to prison. He's your brother, Clara. You have so much money now. You don't need that credit score. You don't need that warehouse. You could have helped us. You were supposed to help us. I looked at the woman who gave birth to me. I looked at the mind-boggling depths of her delusion. She had just been caught trying to commit massive federal fraud against her own daughter, and her first instinct was to blame me for not volunteering to be a victim. I don't owe you my destruction, Mother, I replied, my voice unyielding. And I certainly don't owe you my financial security to cover up your criminal conspiracies. The last few remaining family members began to back away toward the exits. They had stayed for the drama, but identity theft and bank fraud crossed a line that none of them wanted any part of. Uncle Thomas shook his head in absolute disgust, turning his back on my father as he guided his wife off the terrace. They were abandoning the Andersons completely and permanently. Arthur tried to stand taller, attempting to summon the terrifying patriarchal authority that had ruled our family for decades. He puffed out his chest, but his hands were shaking uncontrollably. "Listen to me, Clara," he ordered, his voice coarse and unsteady. "We are your family. We made a desperate choice in a desperate moment, but you've already stopped the loan. No real harm was done. The transaction didn't go through. We can quiet this down. We can resolve this internally without involving the authorities. You've proven your strength. You are the successful one. Now act like an adult and help us fix this." He was still giving orders, even backed into a corner, even covered in the evidence of his own choices. He truly believed he had the right to tell me what to do. He remained convinced that he was the absolute, untouchable king of the castle. "No harm done," I repeated, echoing his words. "You tried to throw me in front of a speeding train, Dad. The only reason I am not standing here tonight, burdened with $15 million of fraudulent debt, is because my network defense systems flagged the unauthorized credit inquiry and intercepted the transaction before the funds could be dispersed. You didn't show mercy. You just got caught." Marcus pulled a sleek black folder from her briefcase, setting it down gently next to the other evidence on the table. "As your legal counsel, Arthur, I strongly advise you to stop speaking immediately," Marcus suggested smoothly. "Every word you say is being precisely recorded. The fraudulent loan application containing your forged signature, along with the complete audit data of Julian's embezzlement, has already been turned over to the federal authorities." Arthur stumbled back a few steps, as if physically struck. "You reported us," he gasped, clutching his chest. "You turned your own parents over to the investigators." "I didn't turn you in, Dad," I corrected him coldly. "The moment you chose to commit bank fraud, you turned yourselves in. I simply firmly refused to become your accomplice." Letting out a long, agonizing cry, Eleanor dropped to her knees on the stone patio, covering her face. "My life is over," she sobbed into the dirt. "My friends, my house, my reputation, everything is gone." She was still mourning her reputation. Faced with the absolute reality of severe consequences for identity theft and conspiracy, the only thing on her mind was what the women at the country club would say. It was the most perfect, crystal clear reflection of the exact sickness that had infected this family since the day I was born. Chloe, who had been frozen at the edge of the terrace, suddenly rushed forward, pointing a trembling finger at our parents.
"You tried to steal our money," Chloe screamed, her voice cracking with intense panic. "You committed fraud to save Julian, but you never said a word to Liam's family. You let me plan my charity galas with stolen cash. You're all going down, and you dragged me down with you."
Chloe turned to me, her eyes wide with total desperation. "Clara," she begged, clasping her hands tightly together. "Clara, please. You have to tell the authorities I had nothing to do with that mortgage. You have to tell them I knew nothing about the embezzlement. You have to save me, Clara. Please." I looked at my sister, the beautiful sister, the one who spent the entire afternoon mocking my relationship status and calling me a spinster. Now she was begging the ugly duckling for salvation. "I am not saving anyone tonight, Chloe," I said, my voice ice cold. "You all made your own choices. You chose to live beyond your means. You chose to value status over basic integrity. You chose to treat me like garbage because you thought I lacked the power to stop you." I reached out, picked up my crystal glass, took one final sip, and set it down gently on the ruined table. The golden children and the perfect parents had been completely undone by their own immense arrogance. The truth had burned their fake empire to ashes.
But the final realization still wasn't over.
They believed the authorities were the ultimate threat to their survival. They thought the impending legal charges were the final blow. They were wrong. The trap I built for them had one final steel jaw, waiting to snap shut without mercy. Arthur stared at the thin piece of paper bearing his forged signature. The reality of his actions hung heavily over the ruined dining table. But human pride is a terrifying mechanism. Instead of dropping to his knees, Arthur chose to frantically double down. I watched the absurd transformation happen in real time. The panic that had drained the colour from his face was suddenly replaced by a dark, venomous fury. This was a man who, for his entire adult life, was accustomed to crushing opponents with his expensive legal teams and elite country club connections. He could not logically accept that the daughter he deemed utterly worthless had completely outsmarted him. Arthur straightened his posture. With a stiff, trembling hand, he forcefully adjusted his silk tie and squared his broad shoulders. He glared at Marcus, then turned his burning, furious gaze back to me. His jaw was clenched so tight the muscles rippled beneath his skin. "You think you won?" Arthur growled, his voice dropping into the dangerous raspy register he reserved for hostile corporate takeovers. "You think buying this estate and throwing printed spreadsheets on a table makes you untouchable?" "You are completely delusional, Clara. You have no idea what kind of war you just started." I remained completely silent, letting him dig his grave even deeper. I wanted him to exhaust every empty threat in his arsenal. "I have retainers with the top white-shoe law firms in New York." Arthur spat, pointing a stiff shaking finger directly at my face. "My attorneys eat arrogant tech upstarts like you for breakfast. You think you can just hand a few emails to the authorities and walk away? I will bury you in litigation. I will drag this ridiculous real estate acquisition through civil court for the next 20 years. I will file for severe injunctions tomorrow morning to freeze your commercial operations. I will argue in court that you obtained those audit files through illegal corporate espionage. Before your next financial quarter even begins, I will have federal regulators tear your little logistics company apart piece by piece." He took a highly aggressive step toward me, his expensive custom leather shoes stepping brutally through the spilled red wine and shattered glass on the patio. "You bought this property in cash," Arthur sneered, his false confidence artificially inflating with every threat he threw into the night sky. "That means your liquidity is heavily locked up in a physical asset. When my legal team hits you with massive lawsuits for defamation and tortious interference tomorrow morning, all your corporate assets will be tied up in massive investigations. You won't even be able to cover payroll. The moment those subpoenas become public record, your clients will run for the hills. I will torture you with years of grueling discovery until you are utterly bankrupt. You will beg me to buy this estate back at a steep discount just to cover your legal fees." Hearing their father fight back viciously seemed to act like a defibrillator for Julian. The golden boy, who had just been weeping into his hands, suddenly looked up. The threat of total ruin had terrified him, but this promise of toxic legal revenge blew a tiny breath of life back into his pathetic lungs. Julian stood up violently, using the sleeve of his expensive custom suit to wipe the tears and sweat from his face. He looked at me, a distorted, ugly expression of pure hatred on his face. The absolute arrogance of the Anderson men was truly breathtaking. Even facing severe accountability for massive embezzlement, Julian still believed he was inherently superior to me. "Dad is absolutely right," Julian snapped, his voice regaining its usual piercing condescension. "You have no idea how the real business world works, Clara. You hide in a dark warehouse typing lines of dispatch code on a screen, and you think that makes you a titan of industry. You are severely out of your depth." Julian stepped next to our father, puffing out his chest to present a united front against me. It was the exact physical intimidation tactic they had used against me since I was a teenager. "You thought you could just walk in here and destroy us with a dramatic slideshow presentation?" Julian mocked, a cruel smile spreading across his tear-stained face. "But you are just a lucky logistics technician. You don't understand high-level corporate law. You don't understand wealth management or complex asset protection. We have federal judges in our contact lists. We have politicians we play golf with every weekend. You think a judge is going to side with a bitter tech worker over a senior partner at Vanguard Holdings and a veteran real estate tycoon? Julian let out a short bark of a laugh that sounded completely unhinged. You're nothing, Clara. You've always been nothing. You're just a bitter, ugly nerd who spent her whole life angry because she could never sit at the popular table. You think buying an expensive suit and stealing a piece of real estate changes who you are? It doesn't change a single thing. You are still the defective product everyone pities. By the time our attorneys are done with you, you will lose everything. You'll be back on the floor of a freezing studio apartment, working for minimum wage, fixing broken routers, and absolutely nobody will remember your name. Hearing the men of her family fight back, Chloe found a misplaced sense of absurd courage. She stepped out of the shadows, wiping away her ruined mascara, clutching her stained dress tightly.
We will sue you for intentional infliction of emotional distress, Chloe added, her voice piercing the air. You deliberately ruined my dinner. You completely humiliated me in front of Liam. By the time Dad and Julian are through with you, my lawyers will strip away whatever pathetic little pieces are left of your miserable company.
I stood completely motionless at the head of the long table. I didn't cross my arms. I didn't display even a hint of defensive body language. I simply let the cold mountain wind sweep past me while I quietly absorbed their desperate, venomous threats. This was exactly how they operated. When confronted with the appalling reality of their own actions, their first instinct was never accountability or remorse. It was to launch a campaign of total destruction against the person holding up the mirror. They truly believed their social standing and expensive lawyers made them invincible. They believed the rules of the world simply didn't apply to the Andersons. They were trying to use the exact same playbook they had used for decades to bully my mother, the rest of the family, and their business rivals into submission. I looked at Arthur, his chest heaving with false bravado. I looked at Julian, pathetically trying to mask his terror with arrogant cruelty. I looked at Chloe, desperately clinging to an illusion of superiority that no longer existed. Are you all finished now? I asked. My voice wasn't loud, but it carried a terrifying weight that seemed to suck the remaining air right out of the courtyard. Arthur opened his mouth to shout another legal threat, but the words died in his throat when he looked into my eyes. I wasn't looking at him with anger. I was looking at him the way a scientist observes a microscopic specimen under glass. You talk about powerful, high-priced lawyers, Dad, I said, measuring each word with precision. You talk about filing severe injunctions and freezing my assets. You talk about tortious interference and defamation. You throw around these heavy legal terms like magic spells, as if they can instantly vaporize your problems. But you completely forgot a critical, foundational detail about the transaction that took place this morning. I turned my cold gaze toward Julian, who flinched noticeably as he tried to withstand my stare. You just called me an ugly nerd and said, I don't understand corporate law, I murmured softly. You assumed I was a naive tech worker who blindly stumbled into a real estate deal without understanding complex asset management. Did you really think I would expose your massive federal crimes without an absolute ironclad contingency plan to neutralize your retaliation? I took a slow, deliberate step back, moving away from the table and closer to where Marcus stood waiting. You think you can easily drag my real estate acquisition through civil court for 20 years? I said, addressing my father once more. You think you can easily sue me and bankrupt Apex Logistics. You think your prestigious white shoe attorneys can magically save you from the severe consequences of forging my signature on a $4 million mortgage application. I shook my head slowly, a deeply satisfied smile spreading across my face. You are thinking way too small, Dad, I told him. You are staring at a tiny chessboard, completely unaware that the game was over a long time ago. Arthur frowned, his false confidence severely shaken as he desperately tried to decipher my meaning. What are you talking about? he demanded, his voice losing its aggressive edge. "I know exactly what you did today, Clara. You bought the deed to this estate. It's a simple single commercial asset transaction. It can easily be challenged in court tomorrow morning." "I didn't buy the deed, Dad," I corrected him gently. I stepped aside and gestured to my attorney. Marcus adjusted her designer glasses and took a step forward, holding a fresh stack of heavy, legally notarized documents. The Golden children and their arrogant father stood frozen, waiting for the final blow. They had just threatened me with their powerful lawyers. They had threatened me with total financial ruin. They had viciously insulted my appearance, my intelligence, and my future. They had emptied their arsenal of insults, desperately hoping to re-establish their dominance. Now it was time to show them what real corporate power looked like. Marcus placed the heavy stack of documents directly on the ruined tablecloth. She didn't raise her voice. She didn't need to. Her absolute calm was far more terrifying than Arthur's frantic shouting. She looked at my father with the irritation of a strict teacher dealing with a disruptive toddler. "You mentioned with great confidence that you would delay this acquisition in civil court for 20 years, Arthur." Marcus began smoothly, sliding the first sealed notary document across the table. "You threatened injunctions against Apex Logistics. You imagined bankrupting Clara with legal fees. It's an interesting strategy. Unfortunately for you, it is based on a fundamental misunderstanding of what exactly occurred this morning." Arthur glared at the paper, stubbornly refusing to touch it. "I know exactly what occurred," he barked. "She bought the deed to this estate. It's a simple asset transfer." "Wrong," Marcus stated flatly. Apex Logistics did not buy a simple deed. When your son, Julian, defaulted on his margin calls, he foolishly used all the remaining leverage of his company's underlying structure to secure a predatory bridge loan from a parent holding company. Furthermore, Arthur, to evade property taxes, you foolishly transferred the deed of your primary residence 5 years ago, the massive Hamptons estate, where you and Eleanor currently live, into that exact same corporate holding structure. You thought you were incredibly clever, hiding your personal wealth within complex corporate shells. I watched a look of profound realization slowly surface in Arthur's terrified eyes. His aggressive rage was rapidly dissolving, exposing the pure panic underneath. "Clara didn't buy a simple deed," Marcus continued, tapping the document with a manicured nail. "She bought the entire parent holding company. She bought the parent entity that holds the commercial leases for Vanguard Holdings' office building. She bought the corporate trust that holds the deed to your luxury primary residence. As of 9 o'clock this morning, Clara is the absolute sole owner of the building your arrogant son works in, and the luxury home you sleep in every night." Eleanor let out a sharp, piercing gasp. She grabbed Arthur's arm frantically, shaking him.
"Arthur, what is she saying? What does this mean?" "It means, Mother," I interrupted coldly, leaning forward and placing my hands flat on the table. "I am now your landlord. I am also Julian's landlord. I own the roof over your head, and I own the floor beneath your feet."
Julian staggered back violently, gripping the cold stone railing of the terrace. He looked like he was about to vomit. "You can't do that," he choked out. "That's an illegal monopoly. That's unlawful." "It is a standard legal corporate acquisition," Marcus corrected him smoothly. "But let's talk about what actually is unlawful. Let's talk about why it is absolutely impossible for you to hire any high-priced defense attorneys to fight this." Marcus coldly pulled the second document from the stack. The top of the page bore a bright blue federal court seal. She pushed it directly toward my father. This time, Arthur couldn't control himself. His trembling hands reached out desperately, pulling the terrifying document close. As his eyes scanned the heavy legal text, his face instantly turned a damp, ashen grey. "When you and Eleanor tried to forge Clara's signature on a $15 million mortgage application, you foolishly crossed a very specific legal line," Marcus explained clearly, her voice sounding like a judge delivering a final verdict. "You used a digital banking network to transmit fraudulent financial documents across state lines." You attempted to use a stolen identity to illegally leverage a childhood trust that automatically elevated your desperate little scheme from simple state fraud to a massive federal offence under the RICO Act and federal wire fraud statutes. Arthur's breath grew extremely shallow and rapid. He looked up at Marcus with total sheer terror in his eyes. "You submitted it," he whispered, his voice incredibly faint. "You actually turned it over to the federal authorities." "I did not just submit a simple report, Arthur," Marcus said firmly, taking a step back to stand shoulder to shoulder with me. "Because I provided the federal authorities with absolute, irrefutable digital evidence of your bank fraud attempt, along with completely unedited data logs detailing Julian's multi-million-dollar embezzlement. The federal judge did not hesitate for a single second. We immediately applied for an emergency asset freeze to prevent the flight of stolen capital."
The judge granted it instantly.
Marcus looked coldly at the horrified faces of the Golden family. As of 3 o'clock this afternoon, she announced with absolute clarity every single bank account associated with Arthur Anderson, Eleanor Anderson, Julian Anderson, and Vanguard Property Holdings has been completely and totally frozen. Chloe let out a sharp, agonizing shriek. She dropped heavily onto the stone patio, clutching the fabric of her ruined custom gown. "Frozen!" she screamed hysterically. "What do you mean, frozen? Are my accounts frozen too?" "Every single account that received a transfer of misappropriated funds is frozen," Marcus confirmed, ruthlessly, looking down at my sister with zero pity. "Since Julian directly wired millions of dollars of stolen client cash into your personal checking account to fund your lavish lifestyle. Your assets are now officially classified as proceeds of federal bank fraud. Every credit card, every checking account, every savings account, absolutely everything is locked down pending a full federal investigation." Asuna began to hyperventilate severely. She frantically reached into her designer clutch, her hands shaking so violently that she dropped her phone twice on the hard stone. When she finally managed to unlock the screen, she desperately opened her banking app. We all watched in complete silence as a glaring red error message popped up on her screen. "Access denied. Count suspended. Please contact your financial institution." Eleanor sobbed hysterically, tapping the screen over and over again in pure desperation.
No, this can't be happening. Arthur, do something. Call the bank. Call anyone."
"He can't call anyone, Eleanor," I stated with absolute calm, completely devoid of sympathy. "Who exactly is he going to call? His golf friends? The arrogant country club president?" When a family chooses to build an entire empire on deception and theft, the foundation will eventually crumble. They thought they were untouchable, but a single wrong move has left them completely exposed to the consequences of their choices. They had spent years using their financial leverage to push me into the dark, believing that my silence meant defeat. But when you force someone into the background, they learn to watch the patterns. They learn to see exactly where the vulnerabilities lie. Julian remained on the floor, staring at his hands as if realizing for the first time the heavy weight of the legal accountability heading his way. Arthur's chest heaved, his mind racing to find a loophole, a connection, or a legal strategy that could save him. But when the evidence is written in black and white in a federal ledger, status and old money lose all their power. I stood up from the head of the table, leaving the spreadsheets scattered across the white linen. The evening wind swept across the aspen terrace, carrying away the last remnants of the Anderson family illusion. My mother continued to weep into her hands. The reality of her social exile and the looming legal reckoning finally sinking in. They had played a very dangerous game with other people's lives and futures, and now the ledger was being balanced. I walked toward the glass doors of the main house, Marcus following closely behind me. I didn't look back at the chaos, the panic, or the broken pride left out on the patio. The dynamic that had defined my entire childhood was officially over. They had built a house of cards on a foundation of lies, and I had simply let the truth bring it down.